may have done it when it was like a Kickstarter thing, but yeah, I want a remarkable .com.
I need to get you a gavel, Mr. Chairman.
I need the gavel. I'm just looking for a thing.
You could use it.
So when we're ready to begin, I think we just are down Lindy, who might still come, and then Mike Katsy said he wasn't going to be able to make it.
Correct.
And Mike Katsy, by the way, is actually leaving the state, so I think this would, I don't know if he's able to come to our work session next week, but otherwise this would be his last regular meeting.
Oh, okay.
So he's taking a job in Tacoma, actually. So.
His loss.
So, sure. Otherwise, today when Lance and I were going back and forth, we thought we didn't have a speaker for our meeting, but we also there's an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about some of the things that were on our strategic plan, and one of them that we thought was most ripe was talking about property tax exemptions and whether that's a subject, having a little bit of discussion and deciding if that's something that we wanted to dive into and spend some time on as a commission or not. And I think that we had a presentation last month, and then the assessor's coming in today at about 12:30.
He will be here at 12:30. Address any questions you have.
So we can have a little bit more of a discussion on that topic and see if it's something we want to chase down a little more. So, but yeah. Otherwise, I think we've got our roll call is good. Our agenda is approved, right? Do we need to approve minutes?
You don't have any minutes, and I'm behind.
So we need to approve.
Typically, you do approve the agenda. That way, if you want to make any adjustments or amendments, then you can do it. But yeah, I would recommend approve the agenda.
So, yeah. Does anyone have any changes on the agenda, or want to just make a motion to approve?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to just maybe follow up on the election results, and particularly maybe just discuss briefly Prop 9 and whether we want to have discussions moving forward.
Yeah, I thought that was going to be a topic that was going to come up one way or another.
Maybe we could add that to E under informational, or I don't know where to add it.
Yeah, we'll add it under E.
Does that have to be done after just Robert's rules? Does that have to be done during?
After a motion to approve?
Yeah.
I thought so.
I don't know.
I think you make a motion to approve. Did you have that motion?
No. Motion to approve.
Second.
Cool.
Okay, so
I'd like to amend the agenda to include an item E following up on Proposition 9.
Yeah, that would be good. And actually, it'd be really good if is Eric going to make it?
Eric is traveling.
Oh, okay. So we won't have anyone from December. Okay, that's fine.
So you have an amendment to the motion. Any objections to that, or to the motion to amend the agenda? Okay. Then the main motion is the agenda as amended. Everyone okay?
Motion to approve that?
All right. So approved as amended.
Good.
So on the first item, I wasn't aware that Eric was here, but this would have been Eric's last meeting as well. So Desiree, do you have anything from the Assembly's office that you want to share with the BAC?
They are slowly getting budget amendments to me, which I'll get to you, but they're in a transitionary period and we're waiting for Q1 amendments.
Okay. A little bit on this one. The interesting thing about the timing of the elections and timing of first quarter budget revisions, we're going to introduce first quarter budget revisions with the existing assembly. The new assembly will be the one who will be approving it. So we'll be spending some time educating the new members so I'll be spending some time with them talking about the budget, but in the process-wise, but as Desiree mentioned, I think they're working through the elections and things on their agenda. They're anticipating just the receipt of the budget. That's about it. As it relates to this commission.
How is the chair selected for the assembly? Because the chair usually comes to our meeting.
So typically, after the election, they reorganize and they elect a new chair after probably sometime in May, and then they assign committees. I mean, whether or not the assembly chair comes to this one or the assembly chair assigns someone to come on their behalf, they'll do that probably in May.
see anything else then on the assembly that any of us can mention. How many new members do we have then that we're voting
I
on?
think there,
It's gonna be three,
3 new members
Forest and Wilmington,
returning.
so new Eagle River, new Midtown, new West Anchorage.
Who went for it?
Is it Crystal Kennedy?
Oh, okay, thank you. The newspaper just didn't, usually they have all the election stuff on the front, and I never saw it.
She's leading in votes until they're done, counted them all, I think, but I think Crystal is it.
Are there any recounts on anything?
Not that I'm aware of, Lois.
All right, then I think that's probably everything on the assembly then. School district.
So Mr. Dunn is up.
Donnelly?
Well, a lot of action going on in Juneau about the capital bond debt reimbursement. I actually anticipated some of this, and that's why I had moved to amend the originally proposed 6-year plan, which had us putting money on this bond for designs of 2 new major school projects to off 2 years until we saw what would happen with the bond debt reimbursement, because as you might be familiar, there was a 5-year moratorium that's scheduled to run out in 2 years. So before I thought we should obligate the taxpayers to go down the road of spending $80 million plus for 2 new schools, we should know whether they were going to be eligible for reimbursement or not. So those will be right now on the 6-year plan out 2 years, but we might even know sooner whether anything's going to be available for reimbursement of how the legislature deals with the bond debt reimbursement. Obviously, we'll be faced with some major issues if this plan continues, because we've got about, how much a year are we looking at there that we would have to step up and pay for somehow? It's either going to have to come from someplace if that debt is out there. So that's something we're going to need to start talking about if there's no reimbursement for even existing debt that was subject. Now, over the last few years, the amount of that debt as a percentage of the total debt has slowly been reducing because we've been issuing new bonds that are 100% taxpayer paid versus the older bonds, which were 70% reimbursed. And as those older bonds get retired, they were being replaced by the 100% taxpayer bonds. But we still got about 40 million?
41 is what we're looking at.
Yeah,
Next.
that was reimbursable. So if that disappears, then we've got a pretty big hole to fill. Yeah, and we'll have to start figuring out how to do that.
My understanding is that the amount to make up comes to over 400 per average homeowner, I think.
It's 430 per for $350,000 home, which is kind of your average home.
Yeah, right. So it's a pretty significant.
And I think the quandary that we have, and I will be talking about it because it will be part of our first quarter budget revisions, is that the school district's approved budget by the Assembly does not include a mill rate with the $41 million of recovery. It only approves a recovery of the 36, so that's what's in their budget. If we don't if we were to add it to this year's mill rate, we need to do 2 things. We need to get the Assembly to approve that, and then they have to approve this. They have to amend the school district budget to amend their mill rate, amend their their mill rate, and then we would add that into ours. If we don't do it now, we would add it to 2020, and if the process maintains in 2020, we would recover the $36 million that we would have next year, plus the other $40 million that we would be obligated for next year, plus the $40 million that we didn't tax for this year. So it would be a triple in 2020 if it's not added in 19. Does that make sense? Because we're going to assume that we don't recover, we're going to pay for half of it in 19. We're not going to recover for the state. So that'll get put on the books in 2020. When 2020 rolls around, we'll have the part that we are responsible for, the part that the state's not paying for again, and then the part that we didn't include in 19. So in 2020, instead of being $120 for every $100,000 assessed value, it would be 3 times that amount.
So as Lance mentioned, it was 36 for the next year out.
It's roughly that.
Yeah, roughly that. That's because the state portion's gonna decrease every year going out as we're replacing those old reimbursable bonds with 100% local paid for bonds. That's, so the state amount's gonna shrink, but at the same time, because we have pretty consistently stuck to a same amount of outstanding debt, the obligation to the city is going to be increasing just on the local share of that was going to increase anyhow. So it's actually going to be more than 36 that's going to be the increase for every one of those out years, because the local portion's increasing because it's the new 100% local paid bonds are kicking in over the old reimbursable bonds.
And then I have a question about the earthquake reimbursement. Is that totally separate and that,
No, in fact, I proposed an amendment on that subject when we added. Well, first of all, the whole bond proposition that was passed is fungible, basically, because bond counsel wrote an opinion and they wrote language into it that said that because of the natural disaster, it's one of the exceptions to having to list every project, and they gave the school board the flexibility, but the total amount of the bond for anything that had to be done for earthquake-related things. The school board added $4 million to the original proposal. What did it bring it to, like 59? The original proposal was targeted towards the amount of projected debt retirement, so we went beyond that with some more money, specifically hoping to have that available for the Eagle River schools. But the entire rest of it was still available also for earthquakes needs. At the time, I proposed that we add to that we would make a commitment to any money we got back from FEMA or the state for earthquake relief, that we would use that to buy down the debt, but the board rejected that amendment. So they're actually going to have availability of all that money also to utilize when it starts to flow in.
Thank you. So I saw that earlier this week, maybe it was Monday, maybe it was last Monday, during the school board meeting, there was a resolution presented to oppose the reduction in education funding by the state, and that resolution was voted down by the school board. Can you share with us why we didn't oppose that, or what we as community members might consider for why that went that way?
Well, there was no debate on the subject, so it's hard for me to speculate why each individual member voted against it. I can tell you why I voted against it. I can tell you a little bit because Mark Foster sits next to me and he expressed some thoughts to me, while I was sitting there. It had some really poorly written language in it. I mean, it was drafted just terribly. I mean, it made assumptions there was no proof of. It made sweeping statements of this was going to happen or that was going to happen. It was really inappropriately written. And so, I mean, I guess we could have sat there and done a series of amendments all night trying to clean it up, but it seemed like nobody wanted to talk about it, and they just voted it down.
Thank you.
This was talked about at the finance committee meeting last month that there was some debate about including the bond debt reimbursement in the budget or not in the budget, and the implications of those different things. And at the time, the budget was they were leaning towards assuming bond debt reimbursement, right? And there was some back and forth about that. So do you have a sense for where the Assembly's leaning on it now?
I don't. I can tell you the administration's draft that we're going to propose budget to give to the Assembly on Tuesday does not have the $42 million added to the budget for debt reimbursement. It wouldn't affect general government. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not going to affect our outcome as it relates to our proposal. It's just whether or not the administration would propose to the Assembly that now is the time to modify the school district's budget, which then the school district would have to have a role in to add that to the mill rate. But the Assembly, they are discussing it. I am preparing some information based on some what-if scenarios, And that will be part of my presentation to them, because they did ask that question. What happens if we do it now, and what happens if we wait? What would that affect to the taxpayer?
And there was some discussion on the assembly that if that if we assumed we weren't getting the reimbursement, that it would take some pressure off of the legislators to get it back into the budget. But I don't know. And I mean, it's just the House committee that took it out. So there's still stuff that could happen. That who knows.
It's not what I expected from the House.
That committee, it's not a surprise. I don't think the politics gets much better, but unless there's an uprising within Anchorage on our legislators.
Other thoughts to add, Mr.
I think that, Andy's shop is going to be faced with a huge challenge if these cuts come through. And I know some other school districts have been very public with their projection planning for what would have to happen as far as position reductions and class size increases. But we haven't gone through that process yet, so I can't tell you just how, what it might result in.
Right, we did go through, an exercise of here's how many positions it would be. We certainly didn't identify anything. It would be as if we cut across the board for the $106 million the governor originally proposed. So there weren't any finalized plans, just assuming across the board cuts is a little over 1,100 employees or FTE would have to be reduced. So that's kind of the extent of it. It's not certainly creating an alarmist atmosphere is kind of what the superintendent would like to avoid. If you watched Fairbanks, their presentation of what it would affect them is let's take this all put it all in teachers and take it out of the class size and add like 30 students to every class was their analysis of it. Which, if ASD did the same thing, it would be pretty close to what they came up with also. But that's certainly not the message we want to send out, I guess, is to alarm everyone. But, and across the board cut, even if that would increase class sizes by, I think it was 10.
Yes, please.
What is the message that you want to send if you don't want to alarm people? Because I think that there are already people that are alarmed by the budget.
Well, it's not that we don't want to alarm specific groups of people, I should say. We want everyone to be alarmed and be aware of what's happening, but not, you're just going to cut this program, I guess, specific groups of employees within our district. But we certainly want to raise alarm that's going on within the community and within our employees, but not target certain groups.
Right, because if you outline the cuts, it possibly telegraphs intent where there may not be intent, right? It's like, here's a straw man, oh my God, that's my job that's being cut, right?
Yeah.
Anything else on behalf of ASD administration?
Not really. It's about 7 weeks of school left, so I know kids are getting excited to finish up and get out of there. At least mine are.
Sure. Moving on then. I think Lance, you're up talking
Sure.
about revenues and expenses.
So let me start with 2018. I will send you a copy of a report that Dan Moore, who's municipal treasurer, sends to the assembly, and he just sent it earlier this week. So in 2018, on the revenues, out of a total projected revenue of $715 million, they were off by 1.7 million, down. So the revenue projections, and that's from all sources, and that includes all property taxes, tobacco, alcohol, all the variety, and then any garnishments or state revenues we would receive. So Treasury's, I'll send you, it's a simple one-pager. So on the revenues for 2018, we were under a little bit, but I think percentage-wise, those folks in Treasury did an amazing job. On the 2018 expenditures, we're not done with our budget to actuals because we haven't accounted for all of the actual expenses in December, but at least I need to see that. But my last review, we were underspent by probably somewhere between 2 and 4 million, which means I think we out of a $521 million budget, so we were pretty much right on. One of the things that we committed to do to with the Budget and Finance Committee and to this board, there's not many, maybe Carla has been here long enough to remember that we used to do quarterly reports to give to the Assembly, and we would share them with you. But in 2018, we didn't do that because we were still trying to close the books. And so, but 2018, I think, is, there were a couple departments that, actually only one department that I think was over, and that was finance, and it was in payroll because they were doing payroll corrections. But other than that, I think pretty much the departments manage their budget very, very well. But at your next meeting, I will have that quarterly report for you. So I think 18 turned out very good. Moving into 2019, just to let, I'll be very brief. The timing of this meeting, as I mentioned in the email and in the poll, it's a little untimely for some action, so I ask that you guys consider, and I've scheduled a meeting for us to get together in a week. We are about 95% done with our first quarter budget revisions to submit to the Assembly. I'm waiting for a couple pieces of information before we submit that. I can tell you that we started off with about a $10 million gap. It was made up of two primary pieces. One of them was about $3.5 to $4 million in reduction in Medicaid reimbursement. So it's an action, and the Medicaid reimbursement is primarily to ambulance fees and a little bit to DHHS. We're assuming that Medicaid, and it's from two different things. One of them is an action required by the state to give notice that we can recover fees from the feds. There's no state resources involved in the recovery. It's just notice by the state to the public that we are going to get money directly from the feds. That notice has not gone out, and the timeliness of it would not allow us to receive those funds in 2019, so we took them off the books. That was about $3.6 million. There's a little bit more inside the state's budget itself that would affect the Medicaid reimbursement primarily for ambulance fees, so we added that to it. So that's $3.5 to $4 million we know we're not going to include in revenues. The other one was revenue sharing. When we didn't know where the state was going to land, or what the budget would turn out, but the administration is currently making the assumption that we will receive. We budgeted $6.1 million of revenue sharing. We are budgeting that we will continue to receive that revenue sharing in 2019. Upon whatever the legislature does, if the revenue sharing is up or it's down, we'll adjust through the rest of the year. As it relates to the dividend, we budgeted a dividend of $2,500 when we approved the budget. We have not changed that. The reason that number is important is it influences the amount of recoveries of fine and fees that are due to the municipality from folks that haven't paid those. We're about third or fourth in line for garnishment on child support, payments due to the state for anyone who gets their PFD. They garnish that. We get a balance of that. So when the PFD goes up, our garnishments go up, but we haven't changed that at all. So we still had some other movement in the revenues, but overall, I think we're going to be very, very close to our approved budget when you look at the revenue adjustments and then some of the other things that we have. So we're not looking at a $10 million reduction in services. We are looking in probably at a very small amount. We have some things that we are going to take. For example, East High's pool is closed for the year. We're not going to be using it, so the amount of money that's paid for maintenance and electricity and the things that we do there, we're not going to do that. And a couple other things that are going to be the pool.
Oh.
The pool. Due to the earthquake. Not the school.
I just missed the word pool in there.
Oh, my mistake.
I was like,
I didn't feel the heat coming from this side over there.
man, I know I'm slow these
It's kind of
days. but-
interesting, the city they do manage all the pools and handle all that expense for the school districts.
Yeah. So the other thing that in 2019 that we are looking at is the earthquake, because we have to look at the expenses for the earthquake and how we are going to recover those. what happens is we spent about $2 million, we have spent out the door about $2 million in earthquake money. And some of that we are going to get recovered, but some of that we know that we're not going to recover because it's not going to be eligible. For example, any time that we spend going out inspecting buildings, FEMA has decided if you want to go out and help your community inspect residential or commercial properties for earthquake damage, that's on your nickel. You're not going to get any money back. So that's a lot of money. So that's cash out the door. That's cash we're going to have to cover. That's cash we're going to do it. There are some things that we are going to get recovered for, but they're going to be later. So we're blending that into our budget as well. So those are some of the generalities. What my plan is, we're going to give it to the Assembly on Tuesday night. We're going to lay it on the table. I have a work session scheduled with them on the 12th. I'm going to give you a bit of a preview of that work session next Thursday, so you'll see it primarily before the Assembly will see it, but the content will be what's in there. The reason I wanted to do that is that gives you some more time if you want to react or recommend or redirect. Well, the Assembly would do by the 23rd. So the other thing we will be doing is we'll be setting the tax cap and the mill rate. And as the Assembly mentioned, one of the things that I'm working on that I will share with you, as I'm going to share with them, is what happens if the Assembly decides to adjust the school district's mill rate for the recovery of the $41 million this year, and then what happens if worst case scenario in the future. So I will be putting all of that together for them and for you so that you can see that. It affects the taxpayer, it affects the school district's budget. In itself, it could affect our budget, but not indirectly. So I think those are the big pieces that I can share right now with what I have. When I asked in the last page, I mentioned, Mr. Chairman, is I asked departments to give me $10 million worth of cuts. I have $10 million worth of cuts. And so the legislature acts accordingly, or we have to adjust. I can share what fire academies and police academies we won't be doing, what nurses will be letting go, what a variety of things we won't be doing, and the slowing of the business. It's not the money that we'll be saving that will be the presentation. That will be the easy part. It's the service you won't be getting. That will be the story. And that will be in my presentation to them. So, it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the facts we get. If we can't, that is what we have. So that's what we'll work with.
So Lance, the Medicaid reimbursement and the revenue sharing that were budgeted but didn't come
right.
both through the state, what was it that changed on that? Because I didn't realize that any changes were taking effect from the state budget for the current fiscal year that would affect those.
So our revenue sharing, for the Medicaid piece, it's a program that has been, it's a federal program where we have the eligibility to receive federal reimbursement for ambulance transport or Medicaid patients. Lots of states do that. We wouldn't be the only beneficiary, Fairbanks, Juneau, any jurisdiction that does that. It's a direct receipt from the federal government. It's just that we have to go through a process to apply for it. And all it takes really is it takes the state putting out a notice that we are going to ask the feds for reimbursement. The state's not doing any homework to basically do the justification of calls, all of the information that's available for the amount that it would be, the amount of reimbursement that it would require, just requires the state administration to say, we're telling people we're going to ask the feds for money. We need to send that notice out. The recovery is retroactive from the notice, not from when the feds say that we're going to get it. So once the notice is out, it's 12 months typically from when the feds say that, oh yeah, you can get it, which means 12 months from now would be next March or April. That's not money we can count on in 19. It's money we would count on in 20. So that's what's going on with Medicaid.
Does that create a gap?
It does.
Because so there will be a portion that will never be reimbursed. It's not like we'll be reimbursed for that later. If it's 12 months from now, then anything that was...
Right, but when we budget, we create a budget, we're creating a balanced budget based on receipts of money and expenses in a calendar year. I think if we were receiving it in January, we could probably work with the controller and our auditors to basically say you could put a note on the CAFR saying that it's receipt in 19 that we're going to book receipts in 20 that we're going to book to 19, but when you get it in the 5th month of the following, then you start to say, no, better budgeting is, let's just figure out what we have. So that's why we took it out.
Why is the state holding, why didn't they notice? What was the?
I don't know.
Did we,
So our fire chief, our administration, the fire chiefs in Fairbanks, the fire chiefs in Juneau, Ketchikan, they've asked them, please post the notice. And I think recently Mayor Berkowitz and the chief of staff have reached out to the governor's office and said, yeah, we know we're committed to do it, and we will do it. I don't think that's the question. It's just the question of the timing. And the question of the timing is, if they were going to do it in January and February and even earlier, but they haven't, and that clock is gone. So we're going
This
to
is a
take it
new
out.
ability to get recouped on this, right?
It is.
It's a new program, and so this is the first notice to go out, and they're just costing us money by the fact that they're taking time.
Right, and not receipt of that money in an appropriate amount of time, we're not counting on as revenue this
It's
year.
not their money, so they don't care.
But there's also this new effort by the governor to get Medicaid block grants. But anyway, that wasn't what I wanted to say, but I'm just wondering if you think we could do anything. I mean, it's not that hard for us to write a letter,
I
put our
don't-
voices in there, to the governor, and
I think as part of, if you guys are going to take action on the 1Q budget, I think that would be a good point to put in there, because it affected our 19, that we're going to redress in 20. But honestly, Lois, and if you guys have questions on that, I can help you with that as part of your resolution. I think between now and the 23rd, or by the 23rd, it would be good. It's an important piece that we thought we were going to get, that we're making an adjustment that we're not going to get. That's causing a $3 to $4 million gap.
right, and it sounds like the state doesn't have to do that much. So,
Nope.
So if that's more visible,
Yep.
it seems like there would be some
Yep.
pressure to
And
make it happen.
And I think that, again, I think that the mayor's office has reached out to the governor's office recently, but the timing of when we would receive it.
It's all behind the scenes, though.
Yep.
So transparency
Yep.
might help.
It's called Ground Medical Emergency Transport. It's got a new name, but it's basically recovering from ambulance service. And then on the municipal assistance, we budgeted what we received this year. And if that changes, we'll manage expense or make some adjustments.
so it's not necessarily coming in lower than
No,
we thought?
no. We built a budget assuming we would get the same amount this year as the result of this session as we did last session. If that's not the case, then we'll make adjustments. I do suspect that there's some portions of our budget, the dividend, revenue sharing, Medicaid, depending on where the legislature eventually ends, could influence our budget, but we won't know until they're done. So I think we'll have a little bit, I hope we'll have a little bit, well, I'll give you some information, get more robust discussion next week on this one.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to have more questions on that.
Okay.
Then I think that we wanted to, probably the bulk of the remainder of the meeting, to talk about property tax exemption.
Yeah, I think as the chair was mentioning, I asked him, I told him we would have pretty light, so if he wanted, there was a couple things we talked about. One was this, the other is the spending limit, which is something you guys are going to be dealing with coming up, and then, looking forward to building 2020, so scheduling that out. But on the property tax exemptions, as Jack gave you a presentation last week, a lot is going on in property tax exemptions. This commission, put together a report to start auditing exemptions, and they have done some of that work, and they've made a presentation to the administration and to you. And I think Jed asked the questions: how many have you done? What do you need to do more? And what's the timing of that? Should you be doing? Is it worth their time and effort? And then maybe if you have some questions about any more questions about how the assessed valuations as it relate to exemptions applying to earthquake. I don't think there's a direct relationship to the exemptions as much as there is appeals. Appeals of property tax values related to the earthquake are more so direct correlation than they are exemption. So for new members, I will do my best to summarize, and Carla maybe can jump in because she has the most recent history, is that while she wasn't here when it happened, this commission put together a report about 5 years ago about property tax exemptions, who has them, whether it's local government or state government, nonprofits, churches, a variety of those. How much money is that in property tax exemptions that we're going out the door, and have we checked the books on those? And so the previous body was very interested in that, took a lot of action to make sure that there was some auditing done. And so that's, I think, that's the work in a nutshell that happened before. If you guys want to keep the fire on that, where those guys are continuing to audit property tax exemptions for nonprofits or veterans or seniors or residential property tax exemptions, I think that's the discussion before you guys, if there's any value, if you want to weigh in on that. I asked Jack to come and chat a little bit about that if they had some questions. He's given me sort of a breakdown of the $36 or $34 billion in property tax. How much of it is exemptions? You know, how much, if Tasha has an exemption and she's the only one with the exemption, the remaining 6 of you, I mean, we're going to collect $100, but Tasha is exempt because she's a nonprofit and gets that exemption. She gets a 10% reduction on her. We're not collecting less taxes. It's just that it's being picked up by the balance. And then if Jonathan has one and his is 20 cents, then the rest of it's being picked up, because that's how the exemptions work. So the exemptions don't lower the amount we collect. It just rediversifies who's paying. So that's kind of, I think, where I think you are. And if you, I asked Jack to come because I didn't know what you wanted, and he's a heck of a lot smarter on it than I am. So I don't know where you want to go from that, or maybe you want to have Jack sort of let you know where he's at. So it's up to you.
So I recall, I think I asked the question last time about, where is there potential hunting ground for exemptions that are, getting overused or whatever. And I think what you had said was senior exemptions were probably the most likely to have some room for reconfiguring or figuring out.
Why don't you come up here, Jack?
Yeah, come on up.
You don't have to do an assembly number.
But,
I wouldn't
so
wish
we're
it.
not-
I wouldn't.
So I do have some drafts of what we've been doing. This has been more of an internal document. Again, it is a draft. I can pass them out. It just really explains some of what we have been doing with the background. There should be extras. Really what this was intended to do was give a napkin sketch. So it's not just the Budget Advisory Commission that's been asking some of these questions. It's also been, well, for one, we ask the question all the time. By code, we are required to review exemptions every year. However, there's 60+ thousand exemptions to review. So when you have a staff that is dedicated to exemptions of 2, maybe 3 people, that's not very realistic. But we have been doing the best effort we can with that. And so one of the reasons why you're seeing this here is the mayor was also asking, what would it take to do 1 year where we would review all these exemptions? We started to look at it. We started to say, well, 1 year is almost probably not going to happen. It'd be more realistically to do a 2 or 3 year. We're certainly backlogged on that. And so this is really what you're seeing here as far as the plan that we came up with for this. So this is something that we're so far having a green light to try to pursue this, which is, I think, a lot of what you're asking as far as where would our efforts be best allocated and where we get the best measurable effects. I think that really starts to go to that scope of work, that first sentence there. There are about 97,000 residential, senior, veteran, and nonprofit exemptions to review. really what we're going to be starting to focus on is the residential, senior, and veterans. There's just so many of them, and some of these are pretty old applications. So of the 97,000 exemptions, that kind of second line there, there's actually about 67,000 active. So we have a lot of inactive exemptions just sitting in a big pile of paperwork to be basically just gone through. And so it's a little bit difficult right now to pull up an electronic file and say, oh, okay, well, let's go look at the original application. We got boxes. So it's really just, it'd be great to do a one-time effort, and I hope that this will be really follow through with that, to really just do a one whack of inactive, active exemptions. So in a nutshell, that's really what we're looking at, is to do the senior, residential, and veteran exemptions. The residential is $50,000 exemption. The senior and disabled veterans, $150,000 exemption. We're also certainly would like to look at the nonprofits as well. So that includes your churches, charitables, etc. And
there's currently a pass-through on that, correct? Where a for-profit entity that has a nonprofit tenant benefits from the exemption as if the nonprofit owned the building. Is that correct?
It depends. I got Brent to kind of more.
No, if the for-profit entity owns the building, you have to do the ownership and use. So you would not, for example, say a church moves into the end of a strip mall that somebody else owns. None of that's exempt.
Okay.
We've gotten exemptions for education, right? I mean,
you have charter school.
Yeah.
That's in one.
Okay, that might be.
But they have to prove that the lease has gone down because of the fact that they pay the taxes.
Is the reverse on that true, though? If a nonprofit entity owned a strip mall and leased it out to a commercial tenant, they would still be exempt from?
It'd be taxable. It's use. They have to use it for their exempt purpose.
Okay.
Also, are people eligible on the residential and senior veteran? Are they eligible for more than one exemption?
So if you are getting a senior exemption, it's a extremely good chance that you're also getting the residential exemption. So it's $150,000 off with the senior exemption. Add another $50,000, so $200,000 off of your value,
Okay.
to make it taxable value.
And the residential exemption, who doesn't get that? That's
Anybody who doesn't
if
apply for it?
you own a home in Alaska but don't live, or in Anchorage but don't live in Anchorage year round.
So yeah, and that's part of the big review, is really looking at the code. One of the biggest criteria is that you have to reside in the house. It's your primary residence for at least 185 days. So we use the PFD as the first flag or indicator that if they do reside in the home, everything checks out great. If they don't get the PFD, or some type of address is totally different from what is indicating, we'll then generally start to flag it up for follow-up and start to contact that taxpayer and say, hey, some of this is, please help us verify that you live in this house for that time. So that's our kind of first step, the first question to look at. Does that make sense?
So one of the things that I want to bring to everyone's attention, I think, and you may already know this, but just in case you don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes our state legislature will say, hey, guess what, I think every veteran should get, and woo-woo, but that's passed out in the muni. The muni picks up the bill. The state used to reimburse, correct? They don't do that anymore. So, and it benefits them politically to say they're going to give out these exemptions, but in the end, the muni picks up the bill for anything that they decide to pass
Really,
down onto
the
us.
remaining taxpayers pick up the bill now that the state doesn't reimburse, right?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying, the muni had no decision in the state's decision,
Yeah.
and then we pick up the bill. So that's also something that's very concerning, that disconnect between the state and the cities.
Absolutely right, Carl.
Yeah, and I forget what year, I believe they progressively reduced their reimbursement. I think it ended in the late 90s.
It ended in about 84, 85.
Oh,
When they-
really?
When they did, there should have been no more, to me, no more exemptions coming from the state
Yeah.
without community buy-in.
And there's still still a state mandate, still a required exemption for us. The only one that's, the residential is optional. So that is something that we, as Anchorage, chose to
The
do.
nonprofit is a mandate also?
Nonprofit, I believe, is mandate.
One that I hear questions about a lot is some of the medical complexes in town, like Providence Hospital. It is a nonprofit, but my understanding is that a lot of space within that complex is run or is leased to for-profit medical clinics, and so in fact, a lot of that campus is on the tax roll.
I don't know what percentage, but basically, yeah, that's correct. If it is for profit, again, it's really going to go down to the use of the property. Who is the one that's the primary user of it? And so, yeah, if you're a for-profit company, you're not going to fit the description of the requirements for a
I believe
nonprofit.
the number's about 74, 76% is exempt. The rest is taxable.
Of that property
Of profit.
specifically? Yeah, okay. Right. That's good to know.
This might be a question for later on as we talk, but do you know what's the return on investment for reviewing these exemptions? How much is the city getting back in tax revenue?
Yeah.
Either per exemption or for all of the exemptions? Is it covering the cost, or would it cover the cost of the additional staff needed to review all of them?
So I think it's kind of two parts to it. I think the first is my point of view, or at least with property appraisal, we want this to be equitable. So that's the primary motive for all this. But you can see that in 2017, we reviewed roughly 6,000 exemptions, which resulted in about $45.7 million of adjustment to taxable value. And then again, 2018, we reviewed about another 6,000, and that was about $56 million in adjusted taxable value. So
Adjusted up or down?
those were taxable values adjusted up. So I think
Okay.
at a mill rate of 16 mills, just across the board, it's $1.6 million of adjustment. So there's obviously devil in the details about that, but does that help answer that question?
Yeah, that does get my answer. Thank you. Or question.
Has there been any larger holistic research done? If we increase property taxes to these populations of people, do we see downward GDP move? Or we don't have GDP at this level, but how much does that impact the greater economy in a negative way?
It's a good question. I think it might. I guess there's so many questions after that question. I mean, I think the one is, kind of you're getting at like the Laffer curve of at what point does the tax become a burden and you start to get less revenue. I think I do know I was looking at a report some time ago that was put out that was looking not just at property tax but looking at by state the total the total tax burden, and I believe Alaska is pretty low on the list when you start to include.
We're dead last.
We're dead last.
Okay. Yeah, so you include not just property tax, but other
So-
forms.
As a regional economist with a degree in a master's degree in economics, I could answer your question. Generally speaking, the answer there is not much effect at all, because if you think about it, okay, I've got this individual, their taxes are going to go up, and we're not talking about a massive increase in taxes here. That money that otherwise would have been gone somewhere else, could have gone to Amazon, could have gone anywhere, will now be used to fund services inside the local community. So it can actually be stabilizing to a certain degree within the local community economy. People tend to overestimate, because it's very easy to say tax is bad, you tend to overestimate the downward pressure that taxes have on the economy until you get to very high rates. And the United States has not had very high rates in the majority of my lifetime since the pre-Reagan years. So yes, you can certainly draw, if we had an 8% sales tax here and there was no sales tax in the Mat-Su borough, yes, with those sorts of differential effects, you would expect people to start going and doing X, Y, and Z up in the Mat-Su borough. But as long as it's relatively small changes, and then you're taking that money and you're injecting it as services that you're paying for in your local community, the effects are de minimis. It's more of a talking point than an actual economic effect.
Well, and a policy preference more than an economic effect too. If we wanted
Yeah.
to, reward veterans or encourage it or help it ease living standards for senior citizens over there.
I think that would be the effect, is if we say got rid of the veterans exemption, but Mat-Su chose to keep the veterans exemption. Okay, that's a differential effect that veterans would take into account when choosing to live here or live in the Mat-Su, right? So it's those places where you have differential policy that people can arbitrage, choose between, where you really see the effects, long term.
So, even with the exemption on the residential and seniors and veterans, most of that population will still be paying some portion of, some taxes on a portion of their residence. I think the biggest concern is everybody else who needs the fire department to respond, or police to respond, or their roads cleared of snow, and they have zero skin in the game, zero responsibility to pay any taxes for that, even if it was at a very reduced rate. I mean, we've all seen, and I'm all for the church, but we've all seen how churches eat up all the property around them. Tax exemption, a lot of it tax exempt or whatever, but the truth is they need services the same way that we do. And the truth is, unfortunately, we're in a changing society. I mean, churches were the cornerstone of communities 100 years ago, and people rallied to support their church, build their church, nurture their church, but that's not so much society anymore, unfortunately. But the thing is I really think all these exemptions, nonprofit, charity, and things should have just a little bit of skin in the game, somehow, some way. Anybody can set up. It's not that difficult to set up a nonprofit. I'm sure a lot of you know that. If you need it or want it. So that's my thing. That's, I think, what we were heading for before, was trying to get some type of resolution or some type of single voice together to say that needs to be reviewed. It's difficult as hell, because we all know that for politicians to come out and say, yeah, let's start taxing these people, is literally almost death for them. But
I do know one thing that would get all users, all property owners, would be stormwater utilities, driven by the surface area of their impervious surface of their property, not whether they're for-profit or non-profit. Right?
So, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
So, this is I guess a historical story. So, back when Mayor Begich was first running for office, and I noticed this thanks, I think, to Jack's presentation. Back when Mayor Begich was first running for office, if you owned a home, you could bet that your assessed value was probably somewhere between 95 and 100% of the market value, right? I mean, you were pretty close to what it said on the green sheet, was pretty close to what it actually was. And Mayor Begich actually would say, look, if you think that you're overassessed, come on in and I'll write you a check, right? He was joking. If you looked at commercial property, it was only assessed at 80 to 85% of the assessed value. And one of the reasons is that being a state where we don't have to declare property exchanges, a non-registration state, is that we didn't have much data on commercial property. And so commercial property was getting a break relative to the residential homeowner on their taxes, even though commercial doesn't demand as much in the way of services. And so then the exemption came along, and I personally was relatively supportive of the first sort of exemption that we had, because what it did was it balanced out the fact that if you had a home, your assessment was getting updated regularly and accurately. And if you had a commercial property, your assessment was not getting updated regularly, and it was not particularly accurate. It was only to 80% of fair market value. But now, from what I saw from Jack's presentation, it looks like we've gotten much better at assessing commercial data over the last 15 years, and so now residential and commercial are much more equitable in terms of their assessment to value ratio. And so now when we increase the residential exemption inside the muni, we're just shifting the burden from the residential to commercial. And residential is the primary demander of most services, right? I mean, you think about the school district, you think about police and fire and so on and so forth. So for me, it's been a change of, well, now that we've fixed one problem in the system, like, I don't feel the need for more property exemptions. And I find myself much more like Carla in the fact that at some point these exemptions become distortive of the tax burden and the value of the property. And so I don't know if we can go backwards. It's very difficult to go backwards, but I certainly don't want to add more of these. I know we're not talking about it, but that's just kind of a perspective thing that I thought was worth sharing for some reason.
I will mention that there is a couple nonprofits who voluntarily come to the assembly annually, and it's a payment in lieu of taxes. They know that they're not assessed. They know that they use the services. They know that when they call the police department or there are streets outside, and maybe it's symbolic, but it's not nothing. But I do think that the economic climate continues the way that it is for very much longer. Even if it wasn't, the purpose of the exemptions is for equity. And I think the point that Carla is mentioning is there's some equity involved. There's some personal responsibility, and to have 15 acres that's exempt, and while the folks that are members of that organization are paying taxes, whether it's residential or commercial, that particular property is not. So as you guys are debating on whether or not you want to chase exemptions or not, is it something that you want to put on your radar? I mean, I think that's when you were meeting on your strategy session. Is it something you want to keep going? I mean, is it something that you want to refocus on? That's, I think, what I want you guys to think about. And then if you want, I do think that the administration is not letting Jack go. They are going to let him go and keep doing the senior exemptions. They're going to keep on that task with or without your guidance. I think it's just how fast he gets them done and when he gets them done. But there may be other things that you guys have on mind, and I think that's what we think about that, and let us know if you want that. Because about 5 years ago, none of this was going on to the extent it was, and the BAC basically said we got to turn the gap. We got to get some exemptions done because it doesn't feel right. To Jonathan's point.
So I guess for us then as a group, there's kind of two questions. Is one, if this is something we want to pursue further, but also two, what is the way that we can what do we add to this process? What's the actual thing that we do that helps or that contributes? And
maybe what is the goal? I mean, if we get all this data and we understand it better, are we going as a group going to say let's support cutting some of these?
Well, and I'm kind of curious, I think kind of piggybacking on that is, if most of these exemptions are state exemptions and not city exemptions, it would seem like the most that we could do would be to write a letter, to the assembly and maybe to the state administration to say, we think that you should remove these exemptions.
Well, but I think there's a piggyback on there, is that the state has imposed a cost upon us, or a distributional cost upon us with its policies, right? And so we can do that. We can say, please change the policy. But the other thing we can do is we can ensure that our municipality is making sure that the people who are qualified for these things, that the only people that are getting these exemptions are the people that are qualified for them. And so one of the things that it says here is that it would at current staffing, it will take approximately 16 years to complete a comprehensive review.
Yeah.
That's not acceptable. Now, do I want to necessarily think that it has to be done every year? No, but I certainly think that somewhere between 2 and 4 years is a prudent cycle. And so having a supervisor and having, I don't know if they're temps or a contractor or if they're permanent employees who are constantly doing this, and every third year you come up, I think that that's a viable thing, and that is something that we can do to manage our own house.
That's a really, I really appreciate that.
And it
really good.
follows on your question
Yeah.
about the return.
About the return, because
Which
then,
seems reasonable.
Yeah.
You know, that there is a return.
Yeah, lowers the cost of use of return.
Looks like we need a volunteer core of
Do you know what you need
folks
to
that
do
are
every 6 years?
have an accounting background or something. I know a lot of cranky fiscal conservatives that won't stop talking about this issue. I'm wondering if maybe some of them want to actually take a certain case of it. No, I mean, I'm not just, I'm thinking about like my father or something, you know, I'm thinking about what is, you know, what could we, how do we, what should we?
So I was just visiting with Jack, and pretty much many things that we do in the municipality, we either have a code requirement or a policy to revisit them. We do our comp plan every 20 years. We redo our transportation every 4 years. We do the. I was just asking Jack, what's a reasonable cycle of rotation for making sure that every property gets touched, at least audited once, and 5 to 6 years on that cycle. So if you own a church and you're going to get audited at a minimum, and that would sort of keep the cycle. And that's just a target. We can't do them every year, and it seems every 20 is not soon enough, but every 5 to 6 would probably be right. And Jack can put together some information on what it would take to do that, to meet that goal, for the purposes of 2, making sure that it's fair, and 3, and the other one is not getting behind.
So I guess I just want to kind of piggyback off of that too. I got just a couple of points on the point of one, some of this on this draft review. It's just called the napkin sketch. The first point to make out is what we were talking about before, going back to the question of how much revenue essentially would this get. And I mentioned that it was roughly about $1.6 million ballpark sketch of what we received in revenue, or what theoretically we received in revenue for the last 2 years. Those are two, the 2017 and 2018 were samples. I don't know what's going to happen in the future when we start reviewing all of these other exemptions too. Again, there's a lot of inactive exemptions. So that's the first point. The second point with this draft is really going back to what Lance is saying here, is this napkin sketch is really about how to review everything right now to get to a point where it would be a good starting point for the future for a systematic process. I'd hate to put all this effort into this and then not have a systematic process where we do review on a continual basis. So we're not having this discussion 10, 15 years from now. Maybe not me, maybe not,
yeah. No, I really like what you're saying, because what you're saying is what I hear you saying, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that we surge in, we get ourselves caught up, we know where we are, and then we have a cycle of review, right?
Absolutely.
A systematic process, which seems to me to make a lot of sense, because if you were to start the process now, you don't really know where you are, and this is about getting your house in order and then keeping it in order. So I'm piggybacking on what you said. I really liked what you were saying.
Yeah.
Because I think I get the concept of where you're going now.
And so here's, I want to make sure I'm understanding this, because my thought is if we take 25% of these that need review, and we review them this year, then the next year 25, 25, 25. Once we get to the end of 4 years, now we're going back, and so we've started it, but we've lowered the burden every year, so that everybody, and going forward, so not everybody's due every 4 years or 5, whatever it is. Only 25% or 10 is due every couple of years, so it kind of lowers the burden. We're not all caught up for much longer, but then we don't have to kind of charge in and fix it. Look, we are making continual progress, and then once we get at the end of our first cycle, then we are all caught up. Does that make sense? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess very similar, where I'd see this going is very similar to what we currently do for re-inventory. And so when I say re-inventory, it's jargon, but it's really to go and inspect these homes. So by state statute, we have to go and verify the characteristics of the property every 6 years. And so that's what we do. And so every 6 years, we pull out the old sketch, we measure 1 to 2 sides of the house, look at everything, make sure everything hasn't changed. If it hasn't, we move on. And so we're pretty caught up with re-inventory. We have been for quite some time. And I see that very similar to this process where we get caught up, we get the house cleaning done, we get the whole house cleaned, so to speak, and then get that process where, there's not a big burden each year on this. Now, mind you, like I said, too, we have boxes upon boxes of physical paper for these applications. And so one of the goals, too, is to try to move that into a more efficient electronic filing system, too. And I think that would also lower the burden each time, too. So I don't know how much staff it would take each year. I don't know, as far as like what would be a reasonable number of years. My gut feeling would be follow what the state statute says. Every 6 years review that property for the exemption too. But is that so? Basically, I'm agreeing with you on that.
But still with the getting everybody caught up kind of as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that's the first goal to do is to just really start with a clean sheet. Clean up the sheet. Start with a clean data set, so to speak, and then go forward with a systematic process in the future.
Is there an ask in front of the assembly to get to the staffing levels that would allow this, or is that been talked about?
Not at this time. So as far as no, not, as far as just be on the same page. As far as like a reviewing these every 6 years, we'll just keep going with that. Reviewing these every 6 years, there hasn't been any discussion on that. I mean, the discussion right now is just how do we get to a better position than we are now.
So is this something where maybe we could consider a resolution that would go to the assembly supporting the outlines of this? I mean, if that's what the body agrees on.
I mean, I think as you hear Jack, if this is an important issue to you, there's a lot of issues. If this one's to you, where you make your effect is when we're dealing with the budget. I mean, if he needs the bodies to catch up, it's a recommendation on that. And I think one of the things that we talked about is talking to you guys earlier, rather than the strategy of the things that are on your mind on what we're doing before we prepare the budget. And tax exemptions, in order for that to happen, Jack's going to need some support to do that. And Jack, there are things between you and Jack to get him the things he needs that are also bottlenecked. They would have to be widened as well, primarily in employees and HR, human resources. They're constrained in their ability to just the staffing that they have to manage hiring at particular times of the year. So if you want to make an effect, a resolution is one way to do it. The other way to do it is make a recommendation on the budget if this is important to you, to say, hey, we think that based on the plan that Jack's given us and the questions that he's asked since March, he needs 2 more people to do this plan, and that's our recommendation.
And Chuck, is this something that can be done with contractors, or does it have to be staff?
So the devil's in the details, right? And we're quickly learning with some of these constraints of AMEA that it would really have to be a full-time AMEA employees that would have to do it.
I mean, I guess I'm also wondering whether it could be done, could it be a 2-year hire as opposed to
I think we can talk to we can talk to ER and the bargaining unit about that, Lois. It's not a no. It's a negotiated thing because we have in the past, I just don't know if AMEA's bargaining unit allows it. If you have a bump, one-time thing that everyone else, you're not getting rid of union employees to accomplish, you're accomplishing one task, and when the task is done, the task is done. And you give them a scope, they agree to it, and we're done. So, we've done it before.
Yeah, it just seems like that's a little more appealing to when you're making a case for additional.
It just
So I know we're over time. But I don't know, is this something that people are interested in a resolution or tabling for a future conversation? Or I don't want to leave it hanging because I think we've talked about this, it's an interesting discussion. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, a question I would have about that is if we're going to make a recommendation for, as you go forward putting the 2020 budget together, do you want kind of our package of recommendations, or do you just want them sort of us to fire them to you as we take them off our list?
I think either one can work. I mean, really, I can work with either of them because if they're on your mind, it's just that there's probably there are a lot of needs out there, and if you want to prioritize them, I would do that. Pick your top 3, and as we progress, if this is one of those, because exemptions are important to you, you should give it to me. And if you want to give it to me in May, based on what you already know, I'll keep that in mind.
And just to follow up, I would just say, I mean, this seems like fairly low-hanging fruit, and I'm not going to speak for the entire group here, but it sounds like there's generally consensus on this idea. So, yeah, I think we should just move on this for sure.
Should we do a straw poll?
And what we're talking about is basically supporting the outlines of this. Or, sorry, go ahead, Carla.
I kind of feel like we've got 2 different things going here, so maybe May would be a better time for us to get our thoughts together, just because, there's one point is helping you get the review done, but the other point is, how do we feel as a group on the people that are receiving exemptions, and whether or not we feel like those, not so much the review of are those exemptions valid, but the review of our assembly and state of policy of exemption. Yeah. You know what I mean? I feel like they're 2 different
And
things.
that's it. Yeah, I agree totally. I think that second one is sort of a separate issue that would require a more robust discussion, for sure.
Yeah, probably the first one is more actionable in the near term.
Well, I say political, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
Just want to go around the same level, right?
It does get
Well, I mean, I'm talking about fairness and, just ensuring, that something that doesn't bring in stakeholders as much.
So the devil's advocate in me would point out just one thing on this, why we might think about why I am undecided about it, is that if we add new personnel expenses, like we saw in the last budget cycle, how every amendment is like down to the level of like take 100,000 by cutting a position here to add a position here, or that we've been very flat funded. A new expenditure item in the muni budget means a reduced one over here. We're in the scarcity environment, and then we have the tax cap and spending cap on top of that. So if we're adding new positions, that might achieve a more fair distribution of property tax, taxation. We're not necessarily, it's coming at the expense of another municipal position probably somewhere else though, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so that's
It could be.
Which isn't necessarily mean no, it just
Theoretically,
means.
there's a revenue increase here.
But isn't the revenue increase just under the cap though? Isn't it?
Yeah,
Or
it's just a share.
It's
It's
just
a
a
share.
redistribution, that's what I was thinking.
doesn't it
Yeah,
just
it's already
redistribute
taxed
under
at
the
the
cap?
cap, right?
But I think to Lindsay's point, it's up for debate, and here's the reason why. We go back 6 years.
Mhm.
So if they weren't paying their taxes correctly 5 years ago, the books are closed. Obviously, this year, if they're not paying it right, that's under the cap. The stuff in the past, the books are closed, that 1.6, that, is that outside the cap. Jack's got a request into the law department to find out if that's the case. And if it's under the cap, how do we adjust the cap?
Well, that would completely change my thinking on it.
So, I mean, you understand what I'm saying? Because I think, so we've got to read into them, because the point would be, if it costs $100,000 for a position, and we're making $1.6 million, is all of that 1.6 under the cap, or is it a net zero, or is it an adjustment? Because, so those are questions that we have come up with, and we're like, oh, we don't know the answers to those yet.
And those are corrected as they're found? If you find out my taxes are wrong, you correct it at that moment, and I'm responsible at that moment to
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, so when we were reviewing these exemptions, we're looking, correct, for the last 6 years, for the prior 6 years. It has to be relatively clear for us to be like, oh yeah, okay, they were not qualified after, 3 years ago in 2017 or something. So yeah, we would then readjust their taxes from 2017 up to current.
Okay, who's my name?
That's M, little c, big
I'm
C.
actually paying more than I should right now.
So
So I think we need to, we'll have to wrap up. I don't know if this is, I think
Well, I do know that this is of interest to you.
it appears to be of interest to us, so I think we're gonna have to revisit this
Okay,
subject.
okay.
Otherwise, we should mention really quickly before wrapping up, and I know we wanted to talk about alcohol tax, but I think that might get squeezed right now, is that we talked about a work session next week for the 11th.
So, yes, so we're booked for noon here in this room. It'll be just basically a work session meeting. It'll be advertised, be here, same as this one. And I'll bring lunch, so, for the meeting, and it'll be just on it'll be probably a 20-minute presentation on the budget revisions, and ask a ton of questions. And after that, you guys can figure out what you want to do. You'll have basically 14 days before the Assembly acts after that day.
So it's not tentative, it's scheduled.
It's
happening.
booked the 11th in this room.
So good. Yeah, optional of course, but it's great if people can attend and discuss. So otherwise, I think we can probably, our next scheduled meeting would be May 2nd.
So do you want me to put the alcohol stack on the agenda for May, then?
Yeah, I think that seems like
Okay,
it's good.
I think the administration
We'll
is-
have a certified election at that point.
Yeah, I think they're going to regroup and figure out what they're going to do, if they're going to do anything, and I will know then. So next Thursday, and then May, June, and I would like you guys to start thinking about July. If you want to meet in the month of July, obviously we're not going to meet on the first Thursday because it's the 4th. If you want to meet on the 11th, to do that, just think about that. Look ahead, and we can talk about it in the next couple months. I appreciate it.
Do we need a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All right.
Thanks for
All right. Thanks, everybody.
thanks for
When's
sticking
the
around.
11 pass?
Hmm?